What is up, guys? Grandmaster Igor Smirnov is here, and today I'd love to share with you one of the best openings for black against white's first move pawn e4, which is the French defense. Now, it's good for black for a couple of reasons. First off, it's very solid. You avoid all opening disasters, which usually arise from the vulnerability of your f7 square, and then all sorts of bishop c4 sacrifices, all sorts of right liver attacks. They usually target this vulnerable square, which you cover straight away by going pawn to e6. The other advantage of the French defense is that it is not really based on memorization, but rather you understanding correct plans and proper positional play, which you are going to learn from this video, but your opponents are having a hard time playing positions like that when they have no direct attacking moves and they're not really sure what to do. Lastly, even though it's a very solid opening, I'll show you my favorite variation, which is super tricky, and there, something like 80% of moves of your opponents are gonna lead them to an immediate disaster. Alright, anyway, let's take it one by one. Right after we play d5, attacking this pawn on e4, they're gonna need to do something about that. So what can they do? Well, usually they'll pick from three options. They can either push the pawn forward, known as the advanced variation, where they gain some space advantage, and we'll talk about that, of course. Also, they may just defend this pawn with their knight, something like knight to c3, which is known as the classical variation or the normal variation, and sometimes they just trade on d5, choosing the easiest option, and it normally leads to dry, symmetric, drawish variations, but again, I'll show you how to spice it up. Anyway, let's start from pawn to e5, because that's the most popular move, and that's the move you're going to face most frequently. What are you going to do here? Well, once they gain that space advantage, it becomes a little bit uncomfortable because you can't develop your pieces easily to these squares, and therefore your plan becomes to attack these pawns, as once they advance them forward, they also become easy targets for you because they're closer to your pieces. So you play pawn c5 to undermine the central pawn, and if they lightheartedly trade it off, then not only will it allow you to develop your bishop, but also this advanced pawn on e5 becomes isolated, an easy target for you down the road, because you can then attack it and it will become rather a liability for white. So they usually don't do it. They play pawn c3, trying to maintain their pawn chain. But you just add more pressure, you bring the knight out to c6, adding more pressure to the central pawn. They'll play something like knight to f3, also a normal development move, and also they try to solidify their center. And then the variation which I recommend is not the main line, queen b6 and all that stuff, but bishop d7, which is a lot trickier, and I'll show you why in a second. First off, what can your opponent do here? Well, normally they wish to develop this bishop and castle, right? So where should this bishop go? One of the very common errors is to develop this bishop to b5. Like, it is traditionally a good square for the bishop, such as in the Ruy Lopez, but here it's actually already a blunder. You've got a very tricky move, knight takes e5, and it's a move that is very hard to spot for white, indeed. If they recapture this knight, then you grab this bishop on b5 and you gain the pawn, plus now they can't castle, which is nice. If instead they try to grab this bishop on d7, then now you don't have to lose this knight. You drop it back to d7 and you snatch that central pawn in the meantime, which is nice. Now, normally the main line for white would be to develop the bishop right here, because it's really well placed here. White anticipates you to castle kingside in the future, and then this bishop will play a key role in white's potential middle game attack. But of course, we'll have something prepared against that. You're going to play rook to c8. And so far it looks like you've just been developed your queenside pieces, and that is correct, but along the way you're also setting some really juicy traps. For example, if your opponent castles, which is something a lot of your opponents will play, this is going to be already a positional error. And I've even seen the game where Nakamura played this mistake, even though it was a number of years ago, and he lost after that. Because after white castles, which is a positional error, this allows black to trade on d4 and then to play knight to b4. And we're hunting this bishop on d3. Because again, this is the key piece which is going to attack you in the middle game. Therefore, if you can take it away straight away, then basically you'll be totally fine in the middle game. Now, if white wants to secure this bishop and drops it back to e2, that is already a losing mistake. You've got knight to c2, and all of a sudden their rook in the corner is trapped. And that also reveals the point of you having this rook on c8, because otherwise he would just capture your knight. But with the rook on c8, it is possible and you win. Of course, it's much better for white to just give up the bishop and let's say play knight c3, but then you indeed trade it off, and now you just have a very comfortable game. You wish to develop these pieces. Since your knight cannot go here because of the pawn attacking this square, you play knight e7 to reroute this knight to this excellent square on f5. From there, it's going to also put pressure to his center. If white tries to pin the knight and slow down your development, you play h6 and force them to make a decision with the bishop. If they trade on e7, certainly no problem. You just develop your bishop. You've got two bishops advantage. If he tries bishop h4 and persist with this pin, there are different ways to go about this. The easiest is queen b6, which is actually a pretty common move in the French defense in general. In this case, you also get out of this potential pin from the bishop. Plus, you hit this pawn on b2, and just in case for the future, you also add some pressure to this pawn on d4. Of course, right now it is defended, but you're going to add more and more pressure to this pawn down the line. Anyway, right now they need to do something about this pawn. And if they guard it, now your knight is free to move. It is no longer pinned, so you can play knight f5, put in some pressure onto your opponent, and if they do whatever, let's say bishop g3, you can now complete your development, then castle, and I'll just play some moves for white to illustrate the point. And that's what I said when I told you that without that bishop on d3, it's very hard for white to come up with any attacking plan in the middle game, because what can they possibly do here? Like, there is no constructive option, really. And for you, you're already putting pressure to this weak pawn on d4. You are going to play rook c4 to add one more attacker and potentially stack rooks along the c-file. So you keep adding more and more pressure, and white is clueless of what to do. That's exactly the type of scenario you're aiming for in the French defense, and that's how you easily outplay a ton of your opponents. At this point, you may be wondering, Igor, it can't be all that easy for black, and of course, there is a way for white to shut it down. So the main move for white to prevent all those issues with the black knight jumping to b4 is to play pawn a3 right here. But then there is a super tricky follow-up for you. Then you trade on d4, and you play queen b6, targeting this pawn on d4 because currently you already attack it twice, therefore you threaten to capture it, and in general it's one of your main plans in the French defense to attack the base of his pawn chain. We cannot attack this pawn as it's defended by the other one, but the pawn on d4 does not have any supporting pawns, and therefore it's an easy target for you, and we're going to attack it and possibly capture it. If that pawn falls, after that we're going to go after the remaining pawn on e5. Anyways, right now knight takes d4 is the threat. If they wish to prevent this, they need to go bishop c2. They cannot defend it with the bishop from e3, because in that case that will drop this pawn on b2, and we're going to attack the rook as well. So they can't do that. They have to play bishop c2 to include the queen into the defense of this pawn. And now you have another absolutely paradoxical move, pawn g5, which puts things on fire, and if your opponent is not really well prepared, he's very likely to lose the game within the next couple moves. Now, there are a couple of ways for white to do just that. One of them would be to grab this pawn somehow. And first off, why should they grab this pawn? Well, first off, it's a free pawn, which they can take either by a knight or a bishop. And secondly, if they don't take this pawn and play something, then you've got just this pawn push forward to g4. You want to drive away this time from f3 and then grab this pawn on d4 with either a queen or a knight. If they try knight a4, the counter attack, is that's the only way to similarly kind of disrupt your plan somehow. You drop the queen back to c7, this knight still needs to move, and after it moves, we've got this knight takes d4, really juicy. One of many tactical shots that we got here, creating so many attacking opportunities right here, as you can see, in every direction possible. And that's a nice thing about the French defense. We very quickly turn from just simple development to a very aggressive attack. And now after, let's say, queen takes d4, we grab this bishop on c2, we now threaten this knight, and if the knight moves, because we attack it twice, you can also go h6, and now all of a sudden this knight on g5 is trapped. There is some rook c4 ideas or bishop c5 ideas, and you just win. Of course, an obvious question is, why not to just take this pawn? Let's say knight takes g5. Well, as you can see, that is actually a blunder. Now you've got knight takes d4. This pawn was no longer guarded by the knight from f3, and from here we're also attacking this bishop on c2. What can they do now? Knight c3 would be another blunder, because in this case, even though they block the c-file temporarily, but after the trade, we can now push the pawn forward, and we're still taking advantage of the rook. Now the knight is pinned down to the queen, and therefore we're going to take it. It's a really funny variation for black, because pretty much all the normal moves of white are losing. That's why I'm telling you that it's so tricky. What else can they try? If the bishop moves back to d3 to get out of danger, then you still penetrate, you go forward with queen to b3, and you still have a ton of pressure against all his pieces off the queen side. White cannot trade on b3, because in this case, it's just a straightforward loss. You attack both these bishop and rook with your knight and with a rook of yours, so that is clearly not the option. What else can they try? If they simply castle, it's not gonna work. We know that all their usual moves just go down quickly. We have all of a sudden rook takes c1 sacrifice, and after it's accepted, there is queen to d3. So basically we won 2 minor pieces for a rook, but that's not the end of story, because now we threaten knight e2, which is a royal fork to his king and queen, and knight b3, which would fork his queen and rook. We are super tricky, and it's not easy at all for white to get out of these forks. If they try some sort of counterplay with queen to c7, trying some check, first off, it's not that dangerous, it's just a single check, but secondly, we've got this knight e2 check anyways, and after the king moves, there is knight to g3, another little trick. This time, it's a check to the king, but also a discovered attack of the other one, and then you win. You can just play bishop e7 on the next move, and you win. Now, it's hard to believe, but white is already lost here. And it seems strange because white seemingly did nothing wrong. He just played all normal moves, developed his pieces, but somehow you took over. I also don't know how to explain that, but black is winning here. If he tries knight to c3, another normal looking move, developing a knight, seemingly shutting down the file for your rook, but you do just that. You sacrifice the rook once again, and after the trade, you come with this double attack to his king and rook. And if he wishes to defend the rook by going bishop d2, then the rook is indeed defended, but this breaks the connection between the queen and the other bishop, so you grab it. And now, you're also preventing him from castling. You're threatening knight c2, which would be almost a checkmate. And in general, you have a super strong attack right here. You can play h6, kick off this knight, maybe even bishop b5 to solidify the pressure right there, and you're winning. So how do they deal with your annoying pawn advancement and attack on the king side? Now we already know that accepting this pawn sacrifice with the knight leads to disastrous outcome for white straight away. How about taking this pawn with the bishop? Well, that is also wrong. This time because it leaves the pawn on b2 undefended, and you can go ahead and grab it and attack their rook, so they have to move the knight to defend the rook that way. But now they still interfere with their queen, so you can now grab this other pawn on d4, and their position starts to fall apart basically. Now you also hit the bishop after they trade everything on d4. Now you also attack the pawn, and in general you still put pressure. If they castle, you could take this other pawn on e5, but in that case you'd be falling behind in development and your opponent would have some attacking chances, so it's easier to play bishop h6. This way you also complete your development, you trade off their most active piece, and at the end of the day you're still up a pawn with superior position. You're threatening this pawn on e5, you're putting pressure down here, you're putting pressure along this file, you can bring the rook right here to g8, you can bring the bishop to b5 and attack the rook, you can go with your knight to g4 forward. Like, you have so many attacking ideas here, and you're up a pawn. And just a quick note, I understand that there is no way you are going to remember all these variations, and that's certainly not what I mean. I'm just trying to show you these common attacking patterns and tactical patterns in the French defense, and let's not forget that your opponents probably don't know much about it at all. Plus, if you wish to learn how to find these attacking moves and how to calculate them on your own without relying on memorization, I've got a free masterclass that teaches you how to do that. You can find it by clicking the link below the video in the description. So again, for now, it's more of just showing you these common patterns, and also a promise that other variations of the French defense will be much easier and much quicker. So this is the most complicated one. All right. Anyways, let's continue. So we're almost done. Now, with g5, we're threatening to push the pawn forward. We know he can't take it with the knight. Can't take it with a bishop, so what can he do? Well, he should play pawn h3, that is the correct move, which is again very counterintuitive. But then, we never run out of surprises for your opponent. All of a sudden, you sack your knight in the middle of the board. What's going on here? First you played this weird move pawn g5, now you sacrifice your knight, and I've told you it's super tricky. Now, he needs to do something about that, because not only we sacrifice a knight, but we're also attacking. He cannot take it with a queen, because in that case, this bishop on c2 will be left undefended. You're going to grab it with the rook, and you keep attacking, plus you grab the pawn. So, knight takes d4 is the way to go for white, but now you play bishop c5, forming a battery against this knight, and if the knight moves, we're going to pick up this pawn on f2. That's the whole point. And they actually have to move the knight away. They cannot defend it with the bishop, because as we know from previous variations, as soon as they move the bishop out, it leaves this pawn on b2 undefended. You can take it, hit the rook in the corner. The only way for them to defend it would be to develop the knight, but then this knight stands in the way of the queen. Therefore, this knight on d4 is no longer defended. You take it, and now you overpower white with all these threats, plus you're up material. which means that they don't want to move the knight, but they have to. And if the knight goes, let's say, to f3, then you use your battery to grab this pawn on f2 and to attack their king. Therefore, you got 2 pawns for your sacrificed knight, and you're attacking his king. If the king goes somewhere, then you can notice that bishop b5 basically almost wins the game, but he can still cover with the light square bishop. Therefore, the most elegant solution is to take away that last defender first. Once again, we're sacrificing this rook, and then you play bishop b5. This time, there is nothing they can do to cover their king normally. The other bishop is defended, therefore his king cannot capture it. They have to give up the queen, and you could take the queen right here and win the game, but if you want to be absolute savage, you go bishop g3 instead. That is super brilliant. You're just going for the checkmate, because the queen is still pinned, it can't do anything, and after virtually any move of white, you just play queen f2, and it's suddenly a checkmate. The queen is still pinned, it can't move, therefore it is indeed a checkmate. Which brings us to the idea that the only move for white which saves them is the move knight to e2. Not here, but to e2, because now as you capture this pawn and they move the king, you don't have this move bishop g3. Here it's impossible to play this. You'd love to play this, but you can't because they're going to simply capture it. So that's the whole point of having this knight on e2. It covers the king and does not allow you to move your bishop right there. Then you play another brilliant move, pawn to f6. It seemingly opens up your king, but in reality it fulfills 2 functions. You guard this pawn just in case, but even more so, you just want to open up the f-file so that you can checkmate him. And that is why the most natural move of your opponent, just taking this pawn, would be a losing mistake. Yeah, that's what I really love about this whole variation. All normal moves of your opponent are straightforward blunders that lose the game within the next couple moves. So now if they accept this trade, then what happens is you're going to castle on the next move, put the rook against his king and checkmate him within a couple moves. That's why it's so wrong for white to do that. Again, if your opponent is super well prepared and he knows that, then he will not take here, but will play the correct move knight to c3, ignoring your pawn and just developing. But your plan remains to be the same. It will just take a little longer for you to execute it, because in order to open up the f-file, you'll have to play this move yourself, but then you still wish to develop your knight and castle kingside, put in your rook right here. So let's say if they take it right here, which is again wrong, you then play knight e7. I mean, in this position, you cannot develop your knight here because he would simply capture it, so you develop it right here, and you still are ready to bring your rook and to checkmate him. If he trades on e7, no problem. Your king is absolutely safe here. You don't have your pawns on the king side, but you have this shield in the middle of the board, so you don't worry about your king. And if he tries to attack it somehow, let's say he goes for this queen to d2 or anything else, and he's already lost, by the way. So you go rook f8, put in the rook against his king, preparing for all sorts of discovered checks. If he goes queen g5, okay, that's just a single check. You go to king d6, and you're a winner indeed. Your king is super well guarded, so he can't do anything against it. And on the next move, you're going to utilize the power of the rook and just play bishop e3 check or bishop g3, and it's basically a checkmate. Congratulations, you made it thus far. It was the most complex and difficult variation of the French. The other two are really quick and simple. So the other thing that they can do besides pushing the pawn forward, which we have just covered, is to play knight to c3 to guard this pawn. And now the easiest variation which we can choose here is the exchange variation. We can trade on e4, and now again you don't go for classical lines which your opponents are familiar with, but instead there is a sideline which I love a lot. In the French defense, basically the main disadvantage is this so-called bad light square bishop. It's blocked by your own pawn, you can't get it out, and therefore it is considered bad. So what do? You can play bishop d7 and reroute it to this lone active diagonal, so that on the next turn, after they play whatever, you go bishop c6 and you attack the knight, plus you just rerouted your bishop to a nice square. They'll usually defend the knight, and then you play knight d7, just completing your development, plus you also take control of this square. Because without this knight standing right here, guarding it, your opponent could possibly jump there and try to trade your bishop and double your pawns. But now with your knight controlling this square, that's not a problem. If he ever jumps there, you just trade it off. So they'll usually castle, and now you play knight f6, adding one more attack to their knight in the middle. And if they take right here on f6, they probably anticipate you to recapture with this spare knight from d7, and that would be a possible choice, but it's much stronger for you to all of a sudden recapture with a queen. And now your opponent is somewhat in trouble. You're now putting pressure down this knight on f3. You're ready to capture it, and because you've got your queen, that also puts pressure. That will force him to double his pawns and open up his king, which is undesirable for white. They can't easily move this knight away, as if the knight moves, you're going to grab this pawn on d4. And the knight anyway doesn't have convenient squares to go to. Again, we took control of this square in advance, so the knight of white cannot go there. You're gonna take and win the pawn. Of course, some of your opponents will think, wait a second, I've got bishop g5 and the queen is trapped, I'm winning. But there is a turnaround. You've got bishop takes f3 counter strike and you win. Now, if they take your bishop, this leaves this bishop on g5 undefended and you'll gain just an extra piece. And if they go down this variation, then at the end of the day, we count material and we see that we've got an extra knight. Finally, some of your opponents want to keep it simple and dry, and they want to go for this exchange variation, which is symmetric, and it is considered somewhat drawish. But as my Indian friends tell me, Igor, you gotta spice it up. So we have the way to spice it up and make it a lot more challenging for your opponent. As they try to just continue their development, we're gonna go for the queenside castling, which makes it a lot more fun. So you play knight c6. Our aim is to develop our queenside pieces first, and as they go bishop d3, we then develop this bishop and pin the knight, thus creating the threat of knight taking the central pawn on d4. They play c3 and we play bishop d6. So far we're a little bit hiding our intent, but basically we're still gonna castle queenside. And after they castle, you play queen d7. Now, they're ready to attack your king, but it's not a problem, and we're ready to castle there. If they check your king, no problem, we've got the knight standing right here. We've got a very harmonious setup. They have nothing to do, really. If they ever try bishop g5, a very tempting move of white, which for a second looks like they're putting some pressure against you, but in reality it's not true. This bishop g5 is actually a step in the wrong direction, probably, because it only gives you some temples for your future opponent attack on the king side. So f6 kicks this bishop away, it goes back, now you castle queenside, the move which you were supposed to do anyway, plus you are getting out of this unpleasant situation with the rook, and after you castle, you have a clear attack of attacking his king. We've got opposite side castlings, but now due to this bishop, it gives you extra temples for your pawn push and to attack there, or you can go with your knight forward and also hit this bishop on h4. That's why I said earlier that it's a step in the wrong direction. You also pinned his knight, which is a little bit uncomfortable. Of course, the situation, objectively speaking, is more or less equal, but nevertheless, it feels like you're putting pressure, and you certainly dragged your opponent out of comfort, and now he has to face all these difficult challenges on the king side. Another question that you guys often ask me about is how to study chess efficiently. Do you need to play? Do you need to do puzzles? Do you need to do something else? I've got another video about that. You can check it out right here where I've answered that in details. What are the most efficient ways to progress in chess? And I gave you a complete blueprint, complete study plan, so check it out right here.